Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Graphicsly's first ever Clip Studio Paint workshop. We've partnered up with the amazing Webtoon team to share with you how to create webtoons from start to finish. 6 artists will present across the 2-day event. Each artist will cover a different topic on webtoon creation. We're excited to learn with you. I am your host for the session, Fahim Niaz. Before we start, we have some housekeeping items to go through. This session will be approximately 60 minutes long. Use the link in pinned message in chat to ask questions. Due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. Please respect the presenters during the sessions and only self-promote and exchange social media info during commercials. All sessions will be uploaded to YouTube later on. This workshop is brought to you by Graphicsly, the official distributor of Clip Studio Paint in North America, South America, and Europe. We can't do this without our amazing sponsors, Clip Studio Paint, Webtoon, and Wacom. Clip Studio Paint is the leading app with all the features you need to create your comic series ready to be published on Webtoon Canvas. Webtoon is one of the largest digital comics platforms in the world. With over 75 million monthly readers, Webtoon Canvas is the side of our platform where any artist can post their webcomic. Wacom is the global leader in the pen display and tablet market for creative users. As a technology company, they provide cutting-edge digital ink solutions for a wide range of partners using and producing smartphones, tablets, and digital stationery. We have an amazing guest to present the first session, Building a Believable World, which will focus on writing your story. Tesslyn Bergin is the creator of the enchanting series, Facing the Sun. She's an East Coast writer and illustrator, and her real creative outlet is writing. It truly shows in her poetic and organic dialogues. There's no one more perfect than Tesslyn to cover this topic. Now I'll pass the session to Tesslyn.
Hi there, my name is Art by Tesslyn, or Tesslyn Bergin. I make a webcomic on Webtoon Canvas called Facing the Sun, and today I'm going to talk to you about building a believable world, and writing, and comic writing, and dialogue, and it's going to be fun. I love writing, it's my favorite part of making comics, like, bar none. I'm classically trained in illustration, but writing is like, it's my baby. That's what I love doing the most out of anything in the world. And I know that it's scary for a lot of people, especially in webcomics, because you're probably an artist, or you're an artist writer team, and maybe it's a little bit daunting to think about doing something that isn't art, because comics it's mixed medium. It's writing and art working together to make a copacetic whole. And I'm hoping to make it a little more fun, and to maybe give you a different ways to think about character writing and world building in a way that's gonna be less daunting and scary. So let's jump right into it. Firstly, I want to show you the tool that I'm using in Clip Studio. I'm using X. I think this might be a tool that's only in X and not in Pro. It's called Stories. And essentially, this is like a page manager. And you can see, this is already in Webtoon format, it's going down. You will be able to see your project as like a whole instead of separate pages. So you don't have to be drawing on a giant canvas. You can actually split up your files into different images and still see the entire thing. So if you're using X, definitely use the story mode. It's amazing. Anyway, so we're going to go over a table of contents. We got 4 parts that we're going to go into. First, it's going to be starting half full. And essentially, it's how to use world building in order to make your character writing stronger. You should never start with your character first. If you already have your world, it's going to do so much for fleshing out your character before you even start to make them. It's amazing. And part 2 is cause and effect. Sounds pretty straightforward, and it is. We're basically going to investigate what cause and effect is in terms of like fiction and a world and your characters, and how to use it to help with suspension of disbelief and to make your story have a reasonable set of logic that your audience can understand and get invested in. 3 is organic dialogue. I love organic dialogue. I love writing dialogue. It's what I'm most excited to talk about. It's going to be our longest section. There's going to be some exercises that we do in that part. And part 4 is just bits and bobs. It's the conclusion. We're going to see everything that we talked about and how it's all just the same thing. These are not elements that exist in their own bubbles. It's everything written together. It feels good. You got all your ingredients in the soup. You're not just drinking boiled water and potatoes separate, you know. We're gonna have some fun with food metaphors today. Everybody loves those. So let's get into part 1. Starting half full. Character and world building writing are interconnected. They're very dependent on each other. It might not seem like it if you're not thinking with that mindset already. But firstly, it's important to understand what world building is. You're establishing a normal. Even if your story takes place on Earth, even if it's a story that you think doesn't need explanation, if, you know, it's very typical, it's still important that your audience understands all the different elements of that society, because it's going to go a long way in explaining why your characters are the way that they are. So, culture, priorities, strife, shared fears, public sentiments. These are just key components that are going to make your world building believable. If you establish these things, you don't need to show them in exposition or anything like that. It could just be how characters dress or what they talk about while they're walking to school or anything that they're doing on their day-to-day basis. What do they talk about? What's the public sentiment? What are their fears? If everybody in a society is scared of the same earthquake or monster or invading force, that is going to help with your world building a lot if you just show that, like, everybody is afraid of this thing except your main character, or your main character is exceptionally afraid of this one thing where nobody else is. That kind of cements their place in their society, which is going to go a long way towards who they are and your audience understanding them. So here we got our first little fun graph. I call this personality juice. I'm sorry, it's a little disgusting, but I think it's a good illustrator. Basically, on the left here, you have a character that you've made that you just made them in a vacuum. And you put all these personality traits into this character that you like, and there's not really a rhyme or reason for these personality traits. It's just what you want them to be, and nothing else. And yet, there's ways to make characters like this good. It's not impossible. But then if you look at this over here, everything below the red is world building. You have your foundational origins, your belief system, their world, their role in it. And all of these things are going to amplify and explain your personality juice. And it's kind of very important that you understand your character very intimately before you even start your comic, because people are going to feel that. People are going to know how much thought you've put into this world and this character and their place in it. And if you just put the juice in, kind of boring. It's half full. It's just the juice. There's nothing really going on here. And personality isn't its own thing. In reality and in well-written stories, it's a cumulative effect of your past and present. It's all the lessons you learned, all the bad things and the good things that happened to you. That's what makes your personality the way that you are. It's not vacuous. It doesn't exist by itself. You're not born with it. So understanding that in reality and then using that as logic in your story is going to help your character writing a lot. And it's going to be way easier to speak to your audience if they believe your character. And this is not a rule. Nothing that I say here is a rule. Don't take anything that I say as, no, you have to do it like this, or you have to do it like that. Rules, in my opinion, in writing and art, they're made to be broken. And it's important that you understand them so you can deconstruct them after you understand them. I deconstructed my own set of guidelines in Facing the Sun in my own comic, where instead of considering this guy here to be bad and this one here to be good, I used it as kind of a character development map, where when I start, my main character, Liza, is a robot. She has no sentience, she has no sentimentality for her origins or the things around her, or even her own life and death. She feels nothing for any of these things. So essentially, we're starting with the half-full character. She has a personality that she's been programmed with, but that's it. And over the course of the story, she gains sentience, and you start seeing in real time how having humanity changes her. And it's essentially just using the graph as a guideline. And all the most interesting stories are ones that completely ignore the rules. They're the ones that ignore convention, and they take the rules and they break them and they put them together however they want, in my opinion. And this is a good way to do that. So don't take anything that I'm saying like at just face value. Just use them as guides. And here, just quickly, the world doesn't exist for your characters. It's a character itself. It's a planet that your characters have to be on, and the world doesn't stop for them. Problems don't stop happening just because they're in a bad way or they're in a good way. Their world should have its own agenda and its own priorities, and sometimes they work with the characters and sometimes they work against them. Sometimes the world is, like in Facing the Sun, the world is kind of the enemy, the entire world. It's about living through a climate apocalypse and all the terrible things that are going to happen to society. Really fun, I know, not relatable at all. And it depends on the type of story you want to tell, but I think in most cases, if your world feels like it has its own agenda and is existing on its own, separate from the characters, it makes it feel much more vast in general, because your characters don't feel like they're in control of anything outside of their immediate interactions, and it makes it more tense and relatable. That's how the world is in real life. Very few of us have any control over anything. So keep in mind how independent your world feels. And of course, this is probably one of the most important things to consider about your story before you even start writing it. What is your point of view? What is your main character's relationship with the plot and inciting action? So, I'm gonna save the world, my best friend is trying to save the world, or I'm the thing that will kill the world. These are all in the same story, and they're vastly different interpretations of the situation. So you can take a story that's been told a million billion times. There's nothing original on Earth. I guarantee you, whatever idea you've had, it's been done. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The idea of originality is dumb. The only thing that you can do that's original is telling a story in a certain way or from a certain perspective that maybe hasn't been done before, hasn't been done too many times before. And even working inside the elements of a trope or even a cliche, a genre cliche, will kind of already establish like a normal for you, and you can build your own story off of something that is already predetermined by the audience because they already have a feeling like they know where the story is going. And you can go against that or you can go for that. It's totally up to you, but it is important right off the bat to decide what your point of view character is. Most likely you're not going to be in the heads of every single character in your story, and that's not necessarily the most interesting way to tell a story anyway. I would pick one central character, and you can be in the head of that character if you want to be omnipotent and hear their thoughts and everything. And make part of your story how they interpret the events and the people around them. If you hear what's in everybody's thoughts, it's just gonna clog up the main story, and it's gonna do way too much revealing way too quickly about people's motivations and their personality traits, and it might be better for you to just bring up those things as they feel organic to the story. You don't need to show all your cards right away. And picking a perspective is going to decide which character that is, which character you're in the head of for the rest of the story. And kind of just to summarize this part, your story doesn't need to be vast for world building to be important. Again, my story has a handful of characters in it. It has like 2 locations so far, and that's it. And it's inside of 600 pages long. But the world building doesn't mean that you have, again, like huge cityscapes and panels that have 200 or 300 people in them. It means that your world is believable and understandable, and that your audience can relate to it, and even that they can pick up details in small things like what the characters are wearing, what they have to do every day, what they talk about when they don't have any obligation to talk about anything in particular, what's normal. And the more time that you dedicate to showing that, like in your script, essentially, the more your audience is going to feel connected to your world. And again, this is not me telling you to just dump a bunch of exposition on your audience. It's actually very important to kind of avoid large exposition dumps if you can, because that's a good way to kind of lose your audience. It's good to don't feel obligated to explain everything right away. The people who really like your story are going to follow it, and they're going to look for little details, and they'll understand that way. Like I said, this is pretty straightforward. Understanding causal logic and why things happen is an important part of real life and also fiction writing. Because if you understand it in real life, and you understand that people aren't just born the way that they are, there's generally pretty understandable reasons for somebody being a certain way, you can apply it to your story. And another graph, another nice little graph. So this is how I conceptualize cause and effect. You have your issue and the total visible effect. And then on either side, you have societal effects up here and social effects down here. And basically the difference between these two is societal effects are basically world effects, and social effects are character effects. So what steps does your society take for this issue to come to this conclusion, and what are the social effects? So let's say in my story, the issue is that my main character, Arya, was left crippled after a climbing accident 10 years ago. And you can say that the total visible effect on the story was that she fell in love with a robot. Now, those two things don't seem connected. They don't seem related when I say them like that. However, you can essentially relate two things, butterfly effect style, to anything as long as you have tight causal logic. Everything follows the same string of logic. So we can say that the societal effects say that she was left crippled 10 years ago after a climbing accident. The societal effects would be the society that she lives in doesn't value disabled people in the same way that they do able-bodied people, so she is left bereft of help. That mental health is not taken as seriously as physical health, so even after she was healed, she didn't have the support that she needed in order to mentally recover from that happening. And the last one can be that she was born into a company that valued useful people more than people that they decided were not useful or not interested in the things that they needed them to be interested in. And that led to her receiving a caretaker robot. And the social effects down here would be that being isolated for 10 years without any external help besides that of a caretaker robot led to her mentally referring to that robot in a certain way, regardless of whether or not she knew that she was doing that. Not having human peers to talk to or relate to or try to grasp her own mental health. And the caretaker robot being the only one who was really emotionally there for her, even if she wasn't, even if that robot didn't have any sentience. It was an object that she learned to grow attached to over time. So total, it led to her falling in love with her caretaker, who is a robot. And so by understanding how these effects work together, you can explain anything in your story. You can explain villains, heroes, a war, a large event in your story that changes it for better or for worse. It can explain why your character eats pizza at 8 a.m. every morning. It could literally explain anything. As long as you, in your world and in your story, have established these things, your audience will find anything that you do believable, even if it's completely crazy. It's just a matter of applying tight causal logic. And as long as you have an understanding of that, you can do really whatever you want in your story and your audience will follow you. So the next part, finally, we're going to talk about organic dialogue. So I try to balance my dialogue personally. I do really, really like just raw naturalistic dialogue, but I understand that it's not necessarily the most efficient storyteller. So I do try to balance them. So in a comic, you want to try to balance natural speech patterns with efficient storytelling. And basically what that means is taking the best of both of these and combining them. So with natural speech patterns, if you listen to how people actually talk, you can probably listen to me giving this seminar and pick out all of these things, because this is just how people naturally react to each other when they're talking. So you have filler words, kind of unclear points or motives, body tone and language, very important in a comic because there is a visual element to them talking, and there could be a totally different story going on with the body language and how somebody says something. And then how blunt or obfuscative they are. What is their personality like? How does it affect their speech patterns? And then over here, you have your efficient storytelling. So you can create personality traits that push certain narratives. Liza, the robot, is very blunt and will just ask questions, and she doesn't really conceptualize that people react to hearing certain things in different ways. And that actually pushes the narrative because it gives you a character that's self-propelling. And then brevity versus breathing room. So measuring pauses and how often you actually give the audience valuable information. I think even with naturalistic dialogue, everything that is said should have a clear purpose. Even if it's not immediately apparent or relevant, like every single line. And that doesn't mean that it's exposition. It just means that your characters feel like they live in their world. So the things that they say, even if they're just like throwaway lines about something or another, actually do tell more about the story. And then actions paired with dialogue. So again, remembering that comics is a visual medium as much as it is a written one. So you can have characters talking about something and then doing something completely different. If they're on their phones or if they're eating a meal together or something like that, like you can be telling a totally different story in the visuals than you are with what they're saying. And you can kind of double dip that way. I like doing that a lot. So we have a little writing exercise here. It's basically trying to think about writing dialogue in a much more non-committal way then, you might, if you're just like opening up a Word document and you have some kind of expectation for how much work you're going to get done or what exactly you're going to establish, doing something like this is more treating writing like a sketchbook instead, like where you doodle something down and you don't really have any sentimentality for it. It's just an exercise. It's just something to warm up. So not everything you write needs to be like a big important thing. It doesn't need to be something that you spend hours and hours and hours doing. This is actually something that you should do very quickly. It'll work best if you're doing it fast. So make a script with 2 people. You don't even have to name them. Here they're just called A and B. Don't go in with a plan, just improvise and see how quickly you can establish an interesting scene and narrative and characterization in just like one panel. Like just do it in one panel, just see what you can accomplish with just the dialogue. And if you can balance like narrative information, characterization, and strong direction, then it's going to become a little bit more obvious how all these things work together while still maintaining that air of actual people talking to each other. So here, did these very quick. This one was like, I don't know, 10 minutes, 5 minutes? I think it was 5 minutes per draft. So we're just going to go through and we're going to kind of ruin the joke. Unfortunately, investigating what makes dialogue good is kind of like just explaining why a joke is funny. It's just really terrible, but we're going to do it anyway. So we're going to start here. We're going to go through all these elements. So we start with character A with just an ellipses right off the bat. And this is, when you start like a story like this, it tells you that there was something happening before you walked into the conversation. And then here, we've got a little bit of naturalism, starting with that. And then, so this conversation is related to the stopping with a comma and adding an and then there's a little divide here. So these are split up in order for the audience to register that there's like a pause, essentially, not a long one. If you want a long pause, then you add a tail, and we'll go back to that. But here it's just a short one. It's kind of just breaking up this pacing of what's being said here. So this is narrative. Giant piles of cash on the kitchen counter, that's narrative, so that's telling you what the story, what's going on. And then here, we've got more narrative and also characterization. So the acknowledgement that character A is apparently a ghost, and that ghosts can't be arrested. Here we got another little naturalistic dialogue break here, which just serves for characterization. And then here we have another narrative. So explaining character A is a poltergeist. Explaining that that means they're a ghost that can pick stuff up. More characterization here. And then you've got a tale. I'm going to talk more about the tales in the second draft because I did more there. But so far, this is how much narrative we were able to establish. And here's more characterization, just great. This has a certain tone to it, great. Don't even need a visual to know what that tone is. And then here, we've got more narrative. This is a little bit too much expositing for my like. I fixed that in the second draft, we'll talk about it. And then here you got an interruption. I like illustrating interruptions like this, like an actual physical barrier between one person saying one thing, because this feels like a very like two people talking over each other, which people do a lot when they talk in real life. And then this is more characterization here and more naturalism. This character doesn't even care that character A is a ghost. Character B is more worried about their cash situation. And then here, this is story driving. You know that the scene is going to continue after this panel is over. So this is, again, very quick exercise. I did this in like 5 minutes. And that's how much story you were able to tell in just one panel. So we're going to go in and we're going to do a second draft on this. And basically that's just taking, this was the first one here, and we're just going to take it and we're going to flesh it out just a little bit. And we're going to try to enhance all the elements that we already had in here. So here, same thing is said, same naturalistic dialogue, but then I have a break here, a full break, not just the little bubble break. And here, this character basically answers the question already. It still ends with an so this is still technically an interruption, but it's not like a full stop interruption like the one below. And then this is a reiteration, but it's also, when people talk in real life, they tend to repeat each other when they're in conversation, especially about something that's like stressful or confusing, like in this case. And then here, instead of kind of pure exposition, we have some characterization and exposition. So, a dramatic ghost fun. So this is characterization and it's narrative. So establishing that character A is a ghost and establishing that character B is pretty flippant about the idea of character A being a ghost. And more characterization here, they're perfectly normal piles of cash. And then we got another break, which tells you that you're going to this dialogue here, because your audience and your eye is going to follow it down. So this is more characterization for character A. And then here, rather than ending with a question mark, we're ending with an exclamation point. So even though this is technically a question, it's a good tone setter for people to actually hear how they're talking to each other, that this is an exclamation. And this is basically saying the same thing. It's still narrative, and it's more characterization. And then you have the naturalistic break here. And then the same poltergeist line, so narration and characterization. And then instead of character A just saying great, they just call character B an idiot. So characterization, and also it's establishing a relationship between these two characters, so double dipping. So this character A is comfortable calling character B an idiot, and you have another full stop interruption here. So this is narrative, but it's actually way more characterizing than it was the first time it was written. So in the first one, it's just pure exposition. Just so I'm clear, you understand that I'm a ghost and you want me to commit crimes with you. Instead, character A says, but if you get arrested, a less likable idiot's gonna move in. So more characterization, and also establishing a more clear relationship between these two, and a reason for the story to continue. So this could be its own, 600-page comic if you want it to be, just with this setup. And then these are basically the same, this interruption, and then this narrative, and saying that the story is going to continue after. And then this is more characterization. This person is more taken by the fact that they were called likable than they were called an idiot. Don't care that they were called an idiot, but likable. Oh, you think I'm likable? And then this again is explaining essentially that the comic and the idea continues after it's done. So this was just 2 drafts. And again, that's a lot of narrative heavy lifting that you did. It was just one panel. And this could be its own idea. This is actually a great way, if you don't know what you want your comic to be about, doing a lot of these exercises. I could do a bunch more here. We're not going to go through them the same way that we went through the others. But any of these, in any genre, with any idea, could bloom and do its own project. And practicing non-committal writing like this is a great way to find ideas that feel unique, and they feel like you can get really invested in them really quickly. And how invested you get in an idea will give you a good gauge for how an audience might react to that same story. So just do a little practice. You don't need to draw anything more than this. It could just be stick figures. It literally, no drawing went into any of these panels, and you were still able to get all of that from just dialogue. And we're going to examine the intricacies of presenting dialogue a little bit here. So don't read that giant bubble, please. Oh my god, don't read it. I would never make you read something like this. This is just torture. The way that this is presented is... nobody's ever going to read this. Nobody is ever going... they're going to take one look at this and they're going to be like, what? What? This is a job. You can't just not pay me and expect me to figure out what this says. And it's down to presentation. What we're going to show here is the same exact dialogue, it's the same exact conversation, except it's presented in a different way. So over here, this is actually, if you're trying to be purposely obfuscative, this is a great way to present dialogue, because you're kind of offering your audience a challenge, like, are you going to read this? You'll know more about the story if you do, but I don't actually want you to read it. I've done that a couple times. It is actually pretty fun. However, this is just this is an exercise. So this is the same. We're going to go through it the same way we did in the other panels. So establishing stakes, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. And then this wiggly guy, I'm going to talk more about him later, but I do want you to note that he's there. We have not a page break, a dialogue break here, quickly. I tend to break up bubbles by 1 or 2 sentences, so it establishes a pace to how things are being said. If somebody is just like word vomiting, like here, then it does make sense to present their dialogue in this way, because that is tone setting. But here, being able to actually pace out how these sentences are said is very useful for controlling the pacing and the tone of a scene. So you have an ellipses break here. I wouldn't go too crazy with ellipses. I like them sparingly. But these are basically dramatic pauses. You don't want to use them too much, because you can really easily go into melodrama. But having 2 tails here attached draws out this pause more. Instead of just attaching it to the top, like the one in the last example was, this one's hanging out by itself. And then this is repetitive, but it's saying that this character is having a hard time saying this. When somebody is struggling or doesn't necessarily want to say what they're going to, they tend to repeat themselves. And we got another wiggly guy here, and a really long wiggly guy here. Got a sigh. And then basically the gut punch, and this is where the conversation starts kind of changing. You don't seem to care that it's hurting everybody around you. And then this tail here is basically the tone change. So all of this, it feels like somebody who, the person saying it is in control of themselves. And then it starts to break down. After this tail, this is basically a long tone shifting pause. And then this question, do you know how terrible you were to me last night? This is all by itself. This is between 2 tails, because you want your audience to hang on this for a second. You want them to understand this. And then here you have characterization and pacing. You have another tail. And then this here is really starting to control how fast your audience is going to read this section, because you don't want it to be too fast. You want this to be dramatic, and you want it to have a lot of emotion. So here you have just an insert, exclamation. You have some tails coming out, so you can really grasp how this is being said. It's a very good tone setter. And then here, the bubbles start kind of breaking apart and becoming organic. They're no longer solid. So where this tail here was a certain indicator in the conversation, this is a new indicator. This conversation just got even more bleak. And this person is no longer really in control of themselves. They're kind of letting their emotions take over. And This continues here. I'm tired of this. I'm so tired. This is repetition. Very, very good for establishing a mood. Because, like I said before, repetition is only used in certain times when you're using naturalistic dialogue, and one of those is when somebody is very stressed. And then this ellipses here is just melting into the two that are above and beneath it. And then here's the gut punch. I'm past the point where I want things to go back to the way they used to be. I want you out by the morning. And there's no visuals here. Let me remind you. There are no visuals to how the story is being told right now. This is purely bubbles. This is purely dialogue bubbles. And you're controlling the pace, the tone, the narrative. You probably already have a pretty vivid picture of what this conversation is visually, but you don't even need the visuals. You could probably make a whole comic that's just dialogue bubbles, and if your dialogue writing is strong enough, it'll be amazing to read. I would love to see somebody do that. And this is just a very simple, clear illustration of these concepts. So all the same sentence, except this being said here, kind of, straightforward. Nothing really exciting happening in this conversation. And then here, maybe the person is nervous, maybe even more casual. There's something not solid about how this is being said. And then this is just, maybe it's just pure hatred or fear or some very strong emotion. And again, it's just illustrated by the tail and the shape of the bubble, and that's it. How much breathing room you give to a statement is it's all very important, and it's all very interesting. I would definitely play around with how you present your dialogue in order to get across a certain point or a certain tone. And again, I'm going to break my own rules here. Here, you'll believe this more, even if it's not as clear, just because it's more voice than text. And when I say something is novelized, I mean dialogue that you find in a novel, in a book, is going to be naturally different from the dialogue that you get in a comic, because with a comic, you're seeing so much more than you do in a book that less actually needs to be said out loud. So by not novelizing your text and using your visuals to the utmost that you can capture a more natural tone. And words like this actually inspire confidence and trust because they sound human. And then if you write like this, you'll have a more difficult time connecting with dialogue that's written like this. Even if it's more direct and to the point, people do not speak this way. So this kind of sounds like a robot saying it. Maybe a robot is saying it. That's characterization too. And I would say, unless that is actual characterization. So Liza, my robot, is meant to be kind, vulnerable, naive. She's the character, even though she's a robot, that the audience is seeing the perspective of. She's the most understandable. She's the one that I want you to relate to and to feel for. And I do have a character that talks like the one on the right. Her name's Marianne, and she's purposely distant, cold, and jaded. This type of dialogue will actually make it much harder for your audience to connect to the character that's saying it. And you can harness that. That doesn't need to be a pitfall. You can have a character talk like this purposely to keep your audience detached from them, or to make them seem like they're in a position of power over your audience. Or in Marianne's case, she doesn't necessarily have control over the way that people perceive her. So this has worked to isolate her over her life, and it's had an effect on her personality. And just to push this illustration to its extremes, we have a character like L14 who is a non-sentient robot, and I have her talk like this. I have her dialogue bubbles are just squares. The color is reversed on it. The font it's ochre extended. It's completely different. And I have spaces in between letters to kind of show you stuttering and to show you that she talks much more robotically than other characters. And even just like capitalizing or not capitalizing certain words using completely straight tails. Like, you can get a lot of characterization from just this. You probably already understand her as a character just by seeing how I've laid out her dialogue. So definitely play around. And I think actually one of the most important elements of comic, specifically comic book writing and webtoon writing, webcomic writing, any art that combines writing and visuals, is if you can communicate it with words, do that. There's nothing that bogs a scene down like too much dialogue. Always remove all the dialogue from a scene and look at it without it. And if the same thing is communicated without the dialogue as is with it, even if it's like slightly more understandable if it has dialogue, get rid of it. Just get rid of it. Visuals without the dialogue in comics have immediate emotional resonance, especially if you've set up the moment. Like, there's many ways you can communicate emotions without telling your audience, and the reason why novelizing comics generally doesn't work very well is because it's completely ignoring that it's a visual medium. So always make sure that your dialogue is necessary. Even if it's naturalistic, it needs to have an actual purpose, or else it's always just going to detract from the moment. And we're on to the last part, our conclusion, our bits and bobs. So, got a couple more little graphs for you to look at. And this is just, what is your story's relationship with the audience? And actually, simpler way of saying it is, what's your genre? You have a genre. I personally don't really think that Facing the Sun falls into any particular genre. I call it sci-fi and drama kind of because I have to, but there's elements of all kinds of stuff in it. So establishing what your audience's relationship with your story is going to be, I've kind of divided the pillars of this type of storytelling into 3 parts. So we have empowerment, relatability, and disempowerment. So again, relatability in terms of, is your story understandable to your audience? Your audience doesn't need to be in the shoes of a character, but do they understand to it, and can they empathize with the characters and with the situation? So you always want relatability. Relatability is basically going to make your story communicable. It will make it so anybody can even have a baseline understanding of what's going on. And you can go in 2 different directions, or you can use them both. I use both in my story. And if you just go with relatability and empowerment, then you're probably going towards action adventure. And the conclusion of this is basically, I will overcome all my problems. Power fantasy. And it prioritizes satisfaction and payoff. So things that are generally easy to read, fun to read, will prioritize satisfaction and payoff over more like human elements of storytelling. And then relatability and disempowerment together are, my problems are not solvable how I wish they were. And this is usually leaning towards horror, thriller, drama. Disempowering your audience means taking power away from them. You are not trying to make them feel powerful. You're not trying to make them feel like the main character. The problems that your characters face don't seem like they can be overcome by force. And this prioritizes vulnerability and emotion. Really, 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 really good stuff if you're writing horror, because you want your audience to feel disempowered and you want them to be scared. And what I generally do in my writing is I find a balance between all 3. So my problems are larger than myself, internal and external. I'm small, but I still matter. And this is a way to have kind of 2 feet in lots of different genres, and it's also a way to write very vulnerable, emotional stories without it feeling extremely nihilistic, because it's very easy to just make everything bad. And that's totally valid if that's the type of story that you want to tell, but your audience is probably going to get to a point where they can no longer connect with your story. So it can embrace realism without drowning in nihilism, and it prioritizes a balance of both. It is both satisfying and has payoff, and you can explore vulnerability and emotion, but you do have to find like a balance between these three perceptions that your audience can have of your story. And then this is all the parts working together. So you have your immersive whole, you've got your organic dialogue, your dynamic characters, your consistent logic, and your believable world. And all these work together to make your immersive whole, your whole comic. And all of these pieces, they're also interacting with each other. So organic dialogue and believable world is how characters talk about their own world. Organic dialogue and dynamic characters are how characters talk about and to each other. And dynamic characters, consistent logic, that's how character development happens and how character arcs happen and how your characters remain believable and likable to your audience. And then your believable world and your consistent logic is a world that operates on its own rules. Your audience can even start to predict things that are going to happen if you have good enough setup for what your world is. So all these elements are working together. And that's all the stuff we've talked about. And we just have a couple more kind of more general points that I want to touch on. Cause and effect for both world and the characters. Every character has a solid reason for why they are the way they are. And solid doesn't mean that they have to be reasonable, because perception isn't necessarily reality. Nobody's perception is going to ever match someone else's or even match reality. It depends on what a character's internal world is, what certain events are going to do to them personality-wise. And this is a little, grandma's telling you to love your story, but really, sincerity is your greatest tool. Love the story that you're telling, and you don't expect it to be perfect. Don't expect yourself to be perfect. You have to treat it like a friend or a baby. Like, you have to be okay with yourself and it making mistakes and growing and learning with time. Like, your first project isn't going to be your best. Your third or fourth or 20th project won't be your best. It's always a process, and you have to be okay with that being a process. And it's going to take a little bit of time. You're going to have to fine-tune yourself. It's all instincts and practice, and, every project that you do will be a little better than the last one you did. And keep that in mind. You don't need to be perfect. Nobody's expecting you to be perfect. You shouldn't expect yourself to be perfect either. And don't give a speech where a nod will do. This might mean more drawing. Sorry, artists. Sorry, artist-writer teams, and also artist-writers. Sometimes a moment is just better if it has more illustration and no words. It helps with pacing. It makes things more emotional. So just really learn to trust your instincts when they're telling you to add dialogue or not add dialogue. And believe in your universe. If you are making a story that requires you to establish reality rules, follow your own rules. There's nothing like a story that breaks its own rules because you accidentally write yourself into a corner, or you can't get the ending that you wanted anymore. You just don't feel like thinking about making a reasonable conclusion to events. Trust your story and trust your own logic, and also be loyal to it, because suspension of disbelief is quite the thing. And if you establish rules, your audience will want you to follow them. And there's always solutions. even if it feels like there's none that makes sense, there is always a solution that makes more sense than one that will require you to break your own rules. And there is no such thing as a bad idea. Not only is there no original ideas, there's no bad ideas. Some of the most successful stories that have ever been told have completely insane 1 or 2 line summaries. It's really not your idea that's going to be bad. It's all in the execution. There's a good way to do just about anything. And understanding that is, it's going to take a little bit of the stress off of like, oh, I need to craft the perfect idea, or I need to have the perfect story. Not important, not even relevant. As long as you establish believable stakes, a believable world, believable characters, you can have just about anything happen, and your audience will be there with you. And, you know, they'll be on the journey with you, and they'll believe it. And look for inspiration in everything. I know nobody likes the person that pulls out a notebook while they're watching a movie. I am that person. You can learn from everything. Everything can be a learning experience, and you can take it from anywhere. If you're writing a comic, it doesn't mean read a billion comics. You can take inspiration from video games. Like, video game cutscenes that have the captions on are amazing ways to study naturalistic dialogue, because generally they're translated like with all of those filler words and pacing built into the captions. But there's also a visual component, so it's actually pretty close to how comics use dialogue. So studying that is really helpful. And reading comics and studying how word bubbles work and how action lettering is, and just how people use gradients to enhance inks and pencil art is amazing. How people talk in documentaries and interviews, I find this very interesting. Like, depending on what the situation is, people talk different. Me talking to a camera, or me talking during a live stream, me talking to my parents or my friend, or just me talking to myself. All of those things have different like cadences to them, and noting that is really cool, because it means you can use it in your comic. Like, a character talking to themselves sounds completely different than a character talking to a camera. So everything is a learning experience. Like, just like open your mind as far as it'll go, and just absolutely like learn from everything you possibly can. And if you're gonna try to tackle anything that exists in the real world, be respectful, do research. Even if you're a one-man show, I do more research than I could like possibly say. I have like gigabytes and gigabytes worth of research for all different kinds of things. Mountain climbing, PTSD, medical complications during surgeries, like all kinds of stuff. And you don't have to be perfect, and you're going to make mistakes. That's just the nature of being one person. You can only do so much research, but you should do it regardless, especially if you're going to be talking about like issues that affect people in the real world. Everybody will appreciate something that sounds well researched, and nobody will appreciate it if it doesn't. So just be mindful and have fun writing. Just have fun. Be non-committal, do non-committal exercises, sketch, and just be fun about it. I want to show you a little bit in here just to kind of draw to a conclusion. Just want to this is my script for Facing the Sun. A bit longer than this. This is what I have printed out. And this stack of notebooks over here is all of my sketch writing. I don't necessarily sketch to draw, but I fill notebooks with just ideas. And it's just for Facing the Sun. It's would this work as a characterization? Would this work as something that happens? Like, I have the entire story laid out, but the process of getting to those points, it kind of bends and changes depending on the type of character that I feel is growing or blooming out of what I've already done. So my panels are not particularly well drawn. And this is how I plan. And this is really helpful for keeping you on track. I usually do about 500 panels at a time. And even if the scenes change a little bit and something happens, I realize like, oh, I actually want this to happen, or I actually want that to happen. You can just take these and like throw them away as you don't need them. Like I think I had a stack of like 15. Each of these pages has 15 pages on it, and there was like a stack of 15 of these pages that I wrote like a couple scenes, and then I realized after like this is not working. This is not saying exactly what I want it to say, and you just throw it out because you can draw one of these in like 30 seconds, not very long. And the way that I organize dialogue here too is I kind of write down generically what I want to be said, like what I want the audience to come away with, and then once I get to that scene, that's where I actually craft the dialogue, because that's something that I feel like I can only do on the fly in terms of like naturalism. And I'll usually do a couple passes. It's usually first or second or third drafts, and then the Bible. Also a Bible of actual things and points and events that happen in the comics, so I can remember that I've done those, and I refer to them when I continue writing into the future. So have a plan. You know, once you find your idea, once you non-committally write enough, once you find your idea, start actually establishing like a plan. And you don't have to be super stringent about this. Like, in my opinion, especially with webcomics, this is very much you kind of figuring out how you want to tell your story. And there will be many ways to tell the story that you want to tell. And just kind of craft your instincts. A lot of this is instinctual. I made all of these slides and I tried to make them, you know, visual. But a lot of the way that I write is almost entirely instinct. It's really trusting yourself to be like, is this the way that this character would say this? Or is this what a character would do? Even if it's bad for the plot or the story, sometimes a character just doing something in character rather than doing something that's important to the plot is much more meaningful to the audience and to you than just forcing a story to happen because that's the way you want the story to happen. So kind of, I guess, just let the characters like take the wheel. And you might be the car, you're drawing the car, but they're the ones driving. And eventually you will form instincts that are strong enough that you will be able to do all the stuff that I've talked about. And, you know, don't be too hard on yourself. I've been doing this for a while. So these are all just tips. I hope you had fun listening and have fun writing.
Thank you so much, Tesslyn. We have a ton of questions, so we'll go through as many as we can within our allotted time. We'll probably definitely go over the 1 hour allotment, and we'll see where we end up. So the first question is, what should I do if a certain part of my story sounds coincidentally similar or same to another story?
I wouldn't be personally too concerned with that. I know it's something that a lot of people worry about, making similar stories to something that already exists. There's original ways to do ideas, but pretty much everything's been done, and you're going to really bog yourself down with worry if you're constantly thinking about something that someone else has already made. If something sounds very similar, just find another way to say it, or change your character or change the inciting incident. If it's just one scene in your story that's similar to something else, people might pick on it, but if it's written, they're not going to care. As long as the execution is there, it really doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you. Plot fillers are something I failed to figure out. How can I create good plot fillers without it being random and doesn't go with the story?
Okay. Plot fillers are interesting because there are good ways to do them. They are just not very usefully employed most of the time. I would say that if your scene or this arc of the story isn't necessarily contributing to the wider point, I would say give it a core that doesn't have to be part of the wider point, or try to establish stakes that aren't going to necessarily change the wider story. Make the character, not development, but character growth. If you want your characters to stay the same after this is over, just show a side of the character that nobody's seen before, one that's already been there. You don't need to develop them into somebody different that you're going to have to work around. Just if a character is usually happy all the time, do an arc where they're sad, do an arc where they're struggling with something, and they can be a more round character after that. If you're trying to avoid getting away from the main plot, just make the focus about the characters in a way that's not going to change it too much when you jump back into your plot.
Okay, thank you. Do you tend to write chronologically, or do you write whatever scene is inspiring you at the time and shuffle them in order later on?
This is interesting. I do both. This is a great example. This slideshow, I wrote this totally out of order. I was just writing slides as I was thinking of them. And then later on, I kind of stacked them on top of each other. It depends on what kind of story you're making. So I would say that if your story is more plot heavy, I would say that mine is not necessarily plot heavy. It's a big focus on characters. Then you should definitely focus on it being chronological, or in the very least have your your beginning and your ending fully figured out before you start messing around with the middle. Because the middle really, unless you have like a huge amount of character growth going on, you can kind of just figure that out on the fly as long as you know what points you want to hit. So kind of do a balance of both.
Okay, that sounds great. How does writing for Webtoon differ from writing for print?
Um I'm on Canvas. I'm not on Originals. I don't have an editor. Me personally, I write for print. I reformat everything that I'm doing when I'm gonna go print it. So all my, it's organized in a down scroll, and then I take all my panels and I redo all the dialogue and all the bubbles in order to format them for a page. So it's, to me, they're the same functionally because that's how I work. Um, there's definitely formatting differences between the two. Definitely. Formatting a page is completely different from formatting a webtoon, but you don't have to try writing any different. You really don't.
Okay, thank you. How do you world build in a way that leads to a familiar enough jumping on point for the reader while still having unique narrative aspects to hook the reader?
Okay. So those things definitely go hand in hand all the time. I wouldn't say that they're separate. If your story is taking place in a world that is very unfamiliar to the reader, so like an alien planet or just a reality that's very different from ours, then you're going to have to lean harder on your characters to be relatable and to make sense. So focus on making your characters, and when I say relatable, again, I don't mean that they need to be reader inserts or that they need to reflect the reader. I mean that they're coherent, and when they feel feelings, they feel them in the same way that we do. That would make them relatable. So either aspect or another needs to feel human, either your world or your characters. And and they can go hand in hand too. You can get your audience invested in like an alien story just by showing the aliens having emotion that's humans. So it's just a balance.
Okay. Do you develop your story world before you start writing, or is it okay to build as you go along? Does your story world logic need to be airtight?
Don't go in thinking it needs to be airtight. I think have it in the back of your head that you want it to be as airtight as possible, but perfection is just not possible. It's just not possible. You could spend 30 years trying to make an airtight world, and by the time you get around to writing your story, it's not airtight. It kind of doesn't matter if it's airtight, even if people can pick holes in it. It kind of doesn't matter. You don't necessarily want that, but it's your story. Just have confidence in the world that you're making, and no, you don't need to hammer it out percent before you start. I had a script and I knew what my start, my middle, and my end were. I actually a lot of improvising in my own personal story. I don't have like a hard crazy thing that I'm working off of that's dictating exactly how I do it. I'd say make thumbnails, like that script that I showed you before, just to keep yourself on this right track. And that track might change directly. I've had times in my story where I was like, well, this was supposed to happen, but it kind of feels like it doesn't make as much sense as I thought it would. So let's just totally go onto a different track. Let's try something else. And that's okay. You can stay loose with your writing. I don't think anything should be precious, especially not with your first project. You're going to learn a lot from your first one and your second one and your third one and your fourth one. You're just going to keep learning. So for your first one, I would say just be invested in it and really don't worry about anything beyond that until you've like fully embraced the process of doing it. Like just start. It doesn't matter.
That's great advice. Are there any specific softwares that you use to keep track of your world building? For instance, spreadsheets, Word, or slides, etc. Or do you do everything with pen and paper?
That stuff I do with pen and paper. And that's just because I find it much easier to be non committal when I'm just like scribbling, which you can't really do in Word. Like, I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but that's not neat. You don't have to, when you're establishing things and again writing non-committally, this doesn't have to be neat. You don't have to go crazy organizing your world building or making graphs and spreadsheets or anything like that. If you're the kind of person that helps, which in some cases it does help me to be very organized, this is my form of organization, keeping everything in notebooks. If that helps you, then that's your process and the right way to do it. If that's your process, definitely try. But to me, staying loose keeps getting too bogged down with like very small details that really like don't matter in the greater scheme of things, and no reader is actually going to notice. It's good to kind of keep yourself loose, like be organized, but don't go crazy. Like be okay with certain things just kind of happening as they happen without having to have a huge plan for it.
Okay, thank you. How do you create villains that don't feel evil but are intimidating and interesting to create a foil for the protagonist? I find my villain's motivation blah.
Okay. I love villains. I didn't say like hero and villains in mine because I don't technically like write that way, but I would say if you want your villain to be like believable and still like likable, give them personality traits that make them that way. Like in real life, people who are very charismatic, doesn't really matter how smart or how nice they are, people will listen to them just because they want to listen to them. So a charismatic villain, there's tons and tons and tons of examples. Like any villain from like early 90s or late 90s Disney fell into this like charisma pool. Any villain in media that you see that's likable is probably also exuding a lot of charisma. Especially if your character's doing like really horrible things, I would lay that charisma on for tricking your audience into liking somebody that's absolutely not likable and has done things. And that's really fun. It's really interesting. But you can mess it up. You can accidentally make a character that's just terrible and that nobody likes and nobody relates to by accident. And your character's motivations, your villain's motivations also should be understandable. It should be something that when your audience sees it, they're like, oh, I might have done that too if that happened to me. Or if I really wanted this thing, I might have gone to this extreme to get it. So making them understandable will go a long way, even if they don't have any likable characteristics. Giving them like that cause and effect, like a solid causal line, will lead your audience down the road of, oh, like, I get it. I understand, and that might be me. Is that bad? So I would keep that in mind writing villains.
Okay, thank you. How do you design the appearance of your characters to fit or not to fit their personality? What design choices do you make?
Okay. I think that might be covered later on by a different person. Personally, I focus on body language a lot. So my main character, Liza, is giant. She's like 6'7". She weighs like 500 pounds because she's a machine, but she's always slouching. She's like literally always slouching. She always looks like 2 feet shorter than she actually is. Her hands are always kind of, she's always gripping her hands, and she has like nervous tics where she like picks at herself, and she makes herself look smaller. And then when she does like fully extend to her full size, that's like a moment of intimidation. Like the comments are always like, oh my god, I forgot how big she was. She's scary now. So for that, like staying away from character design because this is handling that, I would say just the body language of your characters are going to go a long way in just like linking up their personality and their appearance.
A few moments ago, you actually show us your notes, and the next question seems to be very storyboarding.
No, sorry, I didn't hear that when you were breaking up.
Oh, apologies. Storyboarding.
Oh, just how to storyboard or how to handle it?
Right.
I use this
notes,
like,
and then
I use this like a draft. This and the notebooks. The notebooks are mostly fit like really hammering out characters and just scribbling something down and then looking at it a month later and figuring out if it's relevant to the character. This in particular is, this really keeps me on track for what I'm trying to say, what my scene layouts are going to look like. Usually the final draft is what I do in Clip Studio. I don't necessarily follow this exactly. If you just look up comic book layout, that's where I found like this. I think I might have actually made this one based on one that I had seen. Just keep your panels small. Like these are each one page. You can see that. These are each one page, and this is here. I kind of figure out what I want my dialogue to say without necessarily saying it exactly on the page, and what I want my framing to be in my panels. So once you get to the point where you feel like storyboarding is something that you want to do, I would definitely recommend doing this. This is like definitely made the longevity of my comic possible because I just do, I think at first I did like 500 pages, and then I didn't have to think nearly as hard when I was actually making the pages themselves because I already had a template. And each of these little pages, you can do these in like a minute and a half. Don't get precious about how you're drawing them. Give it enough information that you're going to be able to tell what the heck you were thinking when you drew it. And after that, doesn't need to be precious at all. And even this, I've thrown out like 15 pages of this at a time. If a scene just suddenly doesn't work, just throw it away. Replace it with something else, something that works better. Don't be precious with this either.
Okay, thank you so much. When working as a writer with an artist, what are some important things to be able to give to the artist in order to facilitate a good balance of work?
Okay. So with Facing the Sun, I do both the art and the writing. I'm just a one-person team. On my other projects, currently just Untitled Monster Project, which I'm making with my partner, I am the writer for that one. And I make sure that my thumbnails, because I do also thumbnail it, are clear. Like if I want something to be framed in a certain way, then I make sure they can understand that thumbnail when I send it to them. If you're just purely a writer and not an artist at all, I would still say do thumbnails, even if it's like little stick figures. Just the barest example of what you're talking about will help your artists like a ton more than like a paragraph of description would do, because it's easy to get overwhelmed. It's easy for an artist to get overwhelmed with information if you just want to spend a long time describing like one panel, but you could just draw it and have the same exact explanation. It's going to be easier for them. Also, be mindful about what you're asking them to do. Like, try to think, if it's possible for you, think from their perspective, because I do know people who are just they're artists that work for writers specifically, and almost all of them are like, "Oh my god, I like my writer. I don't understand. Like, why do they think that I can draw this? The scene that they've described doesn't even make sense." Like, and work with them. Like, if possible, like work with them as much as you can. If they're drawing a page, make yourself available and tell them that they can ask you questions. Don't like board yourself up and just like throw a script at them and be like, here, it's your turn, hot potato, and then just not contact them again until you're looking for a finished product.
Okay, thank you. We'll do a couple more questions, Tesslyn, and then we will wrap it up. We still have a lot of questions, so it's probably best if we
Okay.
archive them and maybe pass them to you, and folks can maybe communicate with you on your social, and that way there's
Sure.
activity over there. So the next question is, what do you wish you had known before you started your Webtoon career?
Ooh, my career. I I wish that I had known that my first project wasn't gonna be the one that got people's attention. I worked on a much smaller comic called Morange Pai, which was a Romanian folklore comic that I made with my Romanian partner. And I completely burnt myself out when I tried to do that. I was making pages as they were releasing, which actually, that's my advice. Don't make pages as they release. Get yourself a buffer. Don't, if you don't think you can handle releasing every week, I can't, because I like my episodes to be long. I usually have like up to 40 panels in an episode. I do it every 2 weeks because that's what I feel like I can handle. Don't feel obligated, especially if you're on Canvas. You don't have an editor. You're not getting paid unless you're monetizing your work in a different way. Don't kill yourself trying to do something that's basically like impossible, especially with your first project. Like, it's just a learning experience. Your first one it's just learning. You might as well just treat it like it's like a school assignment and you're trying to get a good grade on it, but it's okay if you get like a B or a C. It doesn't really affect anything. Um yeah, so just be nice to yourself. Just be nice to yourself and have a buffer and be organized about how you keep your pages in your computer, and don't really have any expectations going in. Really love the thing that you're making. Have that be your motivation for continuing. Don't give up because you're not seeing the engagement that you want. Just make the comic because you love comics or you love Webtoon. And if success comes, then you work from it when it comes, but don't go in expecting it, and learn how to measure your work in a way that's not going to hurt you.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming down to the end here. There is one really interesting and important question that just came up, and I wanted to also tie that in with the last question. So the question is, how do you monetize your webtoon, and how do you generate income from that? And then the last
Okay.
question is, do you have any general advice before we move on to the last part of the presentation?
Okay. I'll try to say that as best as I can.
Okay.
I monetize my webcomic through Patreon, my Webtoon, and my shop. So most of the money that I make per month is coming from those two places. On Patreon, you get early access to newer pages, which basically would join the Patreon if you're looking to see pages before everyone else, and to join the Discord, where I am there like every single day talking to people. I have a lot of fun in there. I post, panels and previews all the time for anybody that's in there, and engage with your audience and kind of show them who you are, and maybe they'll like you and maybe they'll want to support your work. um, Specifically with Facing the Sun, I do prints of issues. I format them like an American comic because it's I grew up reading American comics. I love them so much. So I release issues of it, and that helps with monetization and just the Patreon. And you can also, if you get to a certain point with Webtoon Canvas, you can also turn on monetization, and that'll get you like, money every now and then from ads. Um, Mostly it's not going to happen right away. It didn't happen right away for me. I made my Patreon like right out of college. Like, I think I was like 20. I'm 26 now. I've been on Patreon for like 5 years. And I've had like little projects now and then that were scattered about what they were about and what they were dealing with. And then this was kind of Facing the Sun was the first thing that I made that made people really want to support me. So just look at different modes of revenue. If you can do a shop and a Patreon, that'll add up to more. Um, yeah. And general advice, treat yourself kindly. Not to sound like a grandma or anything, but you only got one body. Especially for all you artists out there that don't sit up straight. Like, I'm also not sitting up straight now. And you don't drink enough water, whatever. Self-care. We've all heard it 1,000 times before. Go on walks. Don't sit at your desk for 20 hours a day, blah, blah, blah. The reason why not to just turn this into an ad or anything, but the reason why I really like Clip Studio is because with comics, it has a ton of tools that are made specifically for comics. It's for line art, page exporting. It has vector and raster layers. It's got a line magnet built into it. Like, there's lots of little tiny things that it does that have helped me a lot physically. Like, I was using different software before for the first like 100 pages of Facing the Sun, and I had horrible, horrible wrist pain for quite a long time because I was just being very inefficient about how I was working, and because the tools that I was using weren't made for how I was using them. But now use 3D modeling. I use Clip Studio Paint. I try to work as efficiently and kindly to myself as I possibly can. And being mindful of that has kept me from anything like really bad happening. And you read all the time about like teenagers and 20-year-olds that have severe carpal tunnel, and you don't want that. Once your body starts going, it really starts going. So it's not really art or writing advice, but it is something that I think everyone here should do.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Tesslyn. One last thing before we go to the last slide. I wanted to mention that people loved your presentation. I was reading the chat, and they were hoping that you would be kind enough to share some of your slides on your social media. In particular, they loved the personality juice stuff. So it was very interesting. So people were talking about
Okay.
that
Yeah,
pretty
I could
heavily
do
on
that.
chat. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I
And
did
thank you
not
so
think that
much
was
for
going to
your time.
translate. I'm glad people liked it.
Yes, the metaphor is definitely translated very well. And thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. You put a lot of time into preparing for this presentation. We loved it, and it was fantastic.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
All right, guys, before you go, don't forget to follow Tesslyn and check out her webtoon, Facing the Sun. Stick around for a special giveaway. You'll find the link in the chat, and you can enter the giveaway throughout the commercial break. For more details, check out the giveaway link and let the moderator know if you have any questions. We also have many fun videos and tips and tricks during commercial time. Our next session, How a Story is Told by Quirkalicious, will start at 1 p.m. PDT. Drake will go over pacing and boarding. See you again soon.